Hi, I'm Ken Coleman, and welcome to Excuse Me While I Gush. A couple weeks ago, I went on a family vacation to Bermuda. It was on the Norwegian Cruise Line's Norwegian Dawn vessel, and it was an incredible week. Every night, I would be taking in live music from the lounge of my deck while reading Supergods by Morrison. Many of you may recognize that name. He wrote Arkham Asylum for DC Comics in 1989. He wrote New X-Men for Marvel in the early 2000s, All-Star Superman, Wonder Woman Earth 1, and so many other comics. And this book, it isn't your standard Grant Morrison writing, but it is just as deep, philosophical, mystical, and I recommend it as a book that so many people can find insight in. This book is a combination of the history of superhero books and the history of himself. It is a memoir. So you're learning about his experiences, and you're learning about the superheroes that he read about. As George Lucas writes about in his foreword for Uncle Scrooge, Only a Poor Old Man, the first volume of Karl Barks's Uncle Scrooge library, Fantagraphics. Comics are and always will be a reflection of the times they're created from, the views of their creators, and editors, what was important to them, be it social causes, innovations in science, wars. If you're looking at comics from the 1930s, 30s, 40s, 50s, any decade, the content of the stories is a time capsule. And you're learning about what was going on back then. People's views on other ethnicities, and it is very interesting to read about in this book. So Grant Morrison touches upon mysticism, he touches upon philosophy, he touches upon relationships, some of them close, some of them were strained. He talks about trying to provide aid to his cat who was suffering from cancer. He talks about how he wrote himself better from a dangerous infection. He worked that into one of the comic books that he was writing, and that helped him motivate himself to heal. So I'm going to be reading in a passage from Supergods. It has to do with what I imagine is his perception of reality. Superheroes being part of this whole magna creation, but just on a separate Earth. It is using the concept of multiple Earths that Julius Schwartz had created at DC Comics in the 1960s. As a child, I loved to angle 2 bathroom mirrors so that I could look down a virtual corridor into the infinity of reflections that lay in either direction. I imagined that those distant versions of myself, glimpsed at the far end of the receding stack, were inhabitants of parallel worlds, peering back down the hall of faces at me. Alternate realities were as easy as that. They were waiting for us in our bathrooms. And he carries on to mention different versions of The Flash, which, for those of us watching The Flash on CW, we're learning about the different infinite Earths. There were inevitably philosophical ramifications for the reader. If Barry lived on a world where Jay was fictional, and we lived in a world where Barry was fictional, did that mean that we, as readers, were also part of Schwartz's elegant multiversal architecture? It did indeed, and it was soon revealed that we all lived on Earth Prime. I found that so deep. And growing up, I can remember looking at the continual reflection of people in the barber shop that I went to. One mirror facing the other. And as you look in one side, it's the reflection of light bounces back and forth. And you're looking at thousands of yourself. I can't speak for everyone, but I'm sure that many of you have come across this notion. He also gets into concepts like the passage of time, how a character can be in their middle age, how a character can be middle-aged in a comic from the 60s, and still be middle-aged in a comic in the 2016. How in the dimension that these superheroes exist, time flows differently. Comics from some publishers, I find that it works much better. A flaw that I see in Marvel is that they often use too many specific milestones in history to show the superheroes' reactions. So if you've been hearing about the Marvel character Legion, back when the character was first conceived, his mother was a Holocaust victim. Not to take anything away from real-life Holocaust survivors, or his mother had survived. Not to take anything away from real-life Holocaust survivors. But at a certain point, Gabrielle Haller, she would incredibly be a survivor, appearing still middle-aged, if it wasn't for that weird phenomenon of how the passage of time is augmented in comics. Don Rosa, a follower of Karl Barks, comes upon that question in a similar way. He recreates Karl Barks's 1950s environment while holding back on some of what may be racially offensive. He creates that wholesome feel, sort of a talking animal version of Bob Montana's Riverdale. And listen to the writings of Karl Barks and Don Rosa. Their characters are more than just talking animals. They're actual people in the form of animals. And I think that furries are big fans of Duck Burke. I'll have to ask them. So I strongly suggest this book. As I was reading more and more of this, I was learning about how history impacted generations of comic book creators. How Scottish comic book creators like Morrison, Frank Whiteley, and Mark Millar their introduction to American comics came from the U.S. Navy and submarines being so close to Glasgow. the kids growing up would barter supplies for comic books and get their first taste of American pop culture. It was just so awesome to read about. Well, thank you for your time, and check out this book. And a video soon popping up. I'll be talking about one of the people that I learned about in Supergods. Elizabeth, Sadie, Elizabeth, Sadie, Holloway, Marston. Sadie being her nickname. Holloway Marston was the wife of William Moulton Marston, the man credited with mostly creating Wonder Woman, the character of DC's Big Three, who is celebrating her 75th anniversary. And as we approach San Diego Comic-Con, I'm going to be trying to shed more light on her and hope that she can get inducted into the Will Eisner Hall of Fame. Well, thank you, and check out this book. Check out Supergods. Because Grant Morrison is a great man.